Everyone, very warm welcome. Opening the third day of the God in the Indian tradition, God in consciousness in the Indian tradition conference. And our first speaker for this morning is Benedikt Göcke. He's going to be speaking about Karl, Friedrich, Krause's Panentheism in the Vedic tradition. Please. Yes.
Thank you very much. So nice to see you all here. So the German idealists, probably not many people will know, Friedrich Krause, born in 1781 and died in 1832. Not only was Johann Gottlieb Fichte's most able student, a colleague of Schlegel and Schelling and Hegel, but also a teacher of Arthur Schopenhauer, with whom he used to live together in the same house in Dresden from 1815 to 1818. Furthermore, Krause was the originator of the hagiographical tradition in Jena that led to Frege's famous Begriffsschrift, and no one less than Nikolai Hartmann referred to Krause as one of the leading figures of German idealism, whose work essentially contributed to the development of modernity in Spain and Latin America, where his philosophy is known under the name Krausism or Krausismo. Nevertheless, Krause is almost forgotten these days. This is surprising and unfortunate. Since apart from his important contributions to Spanish modernity and to liberal panentheistic cosmopolitanism, Krause also was the first European philosopher whose panentheistic system of philosophy not only, unlike Hegel, highly appreciates the Indian philosophical traditions, but whose work can also be seen as a modern version of ancient Indian philosophical thought itself. Geographically, Krause defined India as follows. India comprises the oldest peoples on the Sindh, Ganges, and Brahmaputra rivers, on the entire southern slopes of the high mountains of Asia, over peninsulas on both sides as far as Ceylon or Ceylon, and the peninsula of Malacca. This part, this comes later, but just leave it there. This part of the world, so India, according to Krause, was the historical birthplace of human education and civilization. Even if the whole of humanity of the ancient earth did not emanate from India, rather from High Asia, nevertheless, human education, civilization did. The Vedas, the Upanishads, the Mahabharata, including the Bhagavad Gita, and the Ramayana, according to Krause, for the first time in human history, collected numerous metaphysical truths about empirical reality, its ultimate foundation, the goal of life, and the ways to achieve it. In terms of their wisdom, the Vedas, according to Krause, who had a strict Lutheran education, even outranked the Bible, and should be considered as the root and the trunk of the religious life of humanity. Sanskrit, because of this, therefore, is not only one of the most important languages in the world, but in fact, quote, the mother of our original language, of which Persian, Greek, Latin, and German are derived. Krause therefore not only recommended learning Sanskrit as an essential language for philosophical reflection, but also felt the need to publish his own system of philosophy in Sanskrit. He didn't do, but he wanted to. Krause, in fact, could have done this, as he seemed to have mastered Sanskrit to a sufficient degree. As he says, precise knowledge of the Brahmanic Sanskrit language has convinced me that this language, especially as it appears in its strict old form in the Vedas, is an original language formed with a scientific spirit. So when I say scientific, I always mean the German Wissenschaft, so not the natural science, but Wissenschaft. Now we're against this background, it is no surprise that, according to Krause, the European rediscovery of the Indian traditions in the early 19th century is of ultimate concern for the future development of philosophy, the arts, and the sciences, even more so than the changes from the Western Middle Ages to Western modernity. Krause says that the reunification of the European peoples with the Indians and with Indian science and art would bring about more important change than the so-called restoration of the sciences after the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks. I already thought in 1807 and realized even more clearly in 1815 and 1814 and 1815, when I gained even more detailed knowledge of the Indian books. So Schopenhauer, by the way, has quite a similar thing to say in his writings, but he said it later. Krause was aware that the Vedas, like the Holy Scriptures of the Christian religion, were written by many authors, collected over a long period of time, and could be classified into four parts. Forgive my pronunciation, the Vajra Veda, the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, and the Atharva Veda. Krause was also aware that different philosophical systems emerged in India, comparable both to the variety of philosophical systems developed in ancient Greece and to the different schools of theological thinking to be found in Christian scholasticism. As Krause says, for thousands of years, a large number of philosophical systems have developed in India itself, which, without the Greeks having had knowledge of the Indians, or the Indians having had knowledge of the Greeks, form a similar structure to the systems of Greek philosophy. Based on the literature on the Indian traditions available to him, Krause distinguished 5 orthodox and 3 non-orthodox systems of Indian philosophy. Vedanta, Nyaya, Samkhya, Mimamsa, and Panentheism yoga, according to Krause, constitute the orthodox traditions based on the Vedas, while Jainas, Baudas, and Shavakas deny the authority. Krause explicitly rejected the Vedanta system because of his understanding of Vedanta. Vedanta is synonymous with Advaita Vedanta and entails the false doctrine of Maya. As Krause says, the main tenet of this system is that the one indivisible being as such has no particular qualities and therefore can be said to be nothing, das Nichts. That is, nothing final, nichts Endliches. When God is at rest, there is no world of physical matter or of living beings. But when God is subject to the drive of infinite longing, Triebe des unendlichen Sehens, the world comes forth as the infinite dream of the divine imagination of mind. God, as Maya, creates the world in which God reveals himself to himself. Nothing in the world has an independent existence. On Krause's view, the biggest mistake of this philosophical stance on reality, however, is the very doctrine of mind. As he says, a basic error of primal Indian philosophy is that the world of the senses, with all its form, is only a deception, only a fantasy play of Brahma with himself, Maya. The reason the doctrine of Maya has to be rejected, according to Krause, consists in the fact that empirical reality ultimately exists and should rather be understood as a divine poem in which humanity plays a significant and substantial role. As Krause says, the doctrine of Maya is a misunderstanding of the idea that the world is an essential poem of God as the original artist. In order to understand this idea, the reality of the human world must be recognized. So Krause also has the metaphor of God literally writing this poem and writing us in such a way to the poem that we are co-writers of the poem with God. So apart from this critique of Advaita Vedanta, Krause, however, did not have a great exegetical interest in the question which of the Indian systems is philosophically most faithful to the spirit of the Vedas. Instead, he proposed his own interpretation of what he took to be the main insights of the Vedas, which, quote, show themselves, as far as our historical knowledge reaches, to be the first independent and peculiar whole of the formation of science, which in regard to the intuition of the absolute, and concerning the organism of all knowledge formed therein, were essentially completed on earth, and in this respect cannot be surpassed or extended. Now we can. One back. Yeah. Krause's interpretation is based on what he identified as the 4 underlying philosophical axioms shaping the Vedas' principal philosophical outlook on reality, which Krause, as we shall see, wholeheartedly endorses. First, the primacy of knowledge. Knowledge is a necessary condition for personal salvation and the prevention of evil. As Krause says, the Indians recognize knowledge as the first foundation of all good, but ignorance as the first cause of all evil. They realize that without knowledge, the spirit cannot attain to true freedom, to pure selfhood, to the highest good. Second axiom, the primacy of God, that is, the ultimate foundation and ground of empirical reality, is the proper and ultimately the only object of knowledge. As Krause says, what is particularly remarkable, however, is the basic feature of ancient Indian education that science, Wissenschaft, prevails in its entire life, and specifically pure science, the highest part of philosophical knowledge, which we commonly call metaphysics. According to the Indian system of science, science is the knowledge of God. Third, the primacy of existential transformation. So there is a close connection between knowledge, spirituality, and the transformation of one's own existence. Because to gain knowledge of ultimate reality is a kind of prayer and meditation. Knowledge of ultimate reality and religious devotion thus do not exclude, but condition and enhance each other. Krause says, yes, it may be said, if it is correctly understood, that scientific research and scientific observation is a prayer of the spirit, which is in itself contained in the called essence, God. Krause could have added Om here, he does in other writings. It is evident from this that the finite spirit, researching science, knows itself before God, in God, and always has God's infinite personality before its eyes. It is therefore absolutely certain that scientific research is a godly religious act, called by ordinary names the worship of God in spirit and in truth. From this emerges the pure, profound, even genuinely scientific, intrinsic, religious sense of the fact that the Indian scientific researchers, philosophers, and mathematicians begin all their scientific works with unification, with a prayer. The scientific reason for this is directly stated in the Upanishad, so the Latin translation of the Persian translation of the Upanishad. Fourth, the proper goal of human life, The goal of life is to become similar to God, as Krause illustrates concerning the metaphysics of Om. The Vedas teach to pronounce the word Om with thought, with contemplation and mind, and declare it to be profound and beautiful according to its individual sounds. This pronouncement is thus recommended by them as a part of becoming similar to God, which contributes to being constantly before God in spirit and mind, and to keeping oneself present before God, in God, for, as the Vedas teach, he who knows God becomes God. That is, such a one becomes similar to God, although in the final. Because we'll find a piece. So based on the hermeneutics of the primacy of knowledge, the primacy of God, the primacy of existential transformation, and the proper goal of life, Krause provides a genuinely panentheistic interpretation of the main teaching of the Vedas. And now that's a bit of a longer quotation. That's quite interesting. So Krause says, the Vedas contain the pure intuition or vision. It depends on how you want to, I presented it here as intuition, but you could also say vision, because in Krause metaphysics there's a lot of seeing. And he said that intuition basically is not so good if we're thinking in the Kantian context, because intuition, considered as a translation of Anschauung, already presupposes that there's a distinction between what you see and yourself. So anyway, the Vedas contain the pure intuition of essence, that is God, Brahma, or the Absolute, and the universal recognition that everything that is, nature and man, body and mind, is in God, or rather, that God in himself is everything that is. That God, that is essence, is present in everything, reigns in everything, guides and governs all life as a whole, that the souls of human beings are capable of becoming one with God if they strive for the knowledge of God, if they grow inward and intimate with God, and imitate God by leading a pure moral life, behaving with others in a just, loving, and peaceful manner, and without following the impulses of fear and hope and of pleasure and pain. If they become similar to God in knowledge, feeling and willing in giving peace to all beings and loving even their enemies and persecutors. According to the explicit and repeated declaration of this ancient Indian teachings of the Vedas, the only means of union with God is the vision or intuition of essence, so God, through true scientific knowledge and pure and unselfish virtue. But the Vedas recognize ignorance as the first cause of all perversion and evil, that is, the lack of the knowledge of God, the mangelnde Gotteserkenntnis, which arises from the limitation to sensuality and the resultant distraction and carelessness. Because Krause considered the Upanishads, to his knowledge written in the 6th century before Christ, to be a collection of the purely metaphysical teaching of the Vedas, it comes as no surprise that of Krause's understanding the Upanishads contain a panentheistic metaphysics as well. As Krause says, God is the one being, the one that is. He has no opposition, and is therefore not to be recognized and named according to any particular quality. He is neither merely the infinite, nor merely the finite, and neither mere doing, nor mere suffering. Apart from him, there is nothing. All that is finite exists through him, and he himself, the unnameable essence, is present in all and rules in all in independent free power, in goodness, in wisdom, and in justice. Humanity's destiny and dignity is to know God, to love God, to become similar to God, to be united with God in this life and beyond. Virtue is God-likeness, must be freely willed, independent of fear and hope, of reward and punishment. These are the basic truths of the Indian system, which are found quite clearly and definitely in the Upanishad. Although Krause himself claimed not to have been influenced by the Indian traditions in any substantial way, I mean, I don't think that's quite true. The reason Krause holds the panentheism of the Vedas and the Upanishads in such high esteem is that ultimately his own panentheism is a modern version of ancient Indian thought itself. So Krause took the Upanishads as an exemplar of philosophy and wished for his own system to be like an Upanishad. As Krause says, if I succeed in bringing even the first 6 to 8 volumes of my scientific work into print, according to the plan and outline that is in front of me, then this will be an Upanishad or mysterium tigendum, rather se ipsum octigens et podigens. The reader will gradually become a mysta or mystagogos. So in line, now we can go to the next one. In line with the Vedic traditions, the single goal of Krause's philosophy thus is to enable a liberated existential transformation based on the proper recognition and intuition of ultimate reality. So Krause formulated the guiding principle of his theory of the absolute, reminiscent of the insights he found in the Vedas in 1813 as follows. My main principle is that all science is based on the intuition of an infinite substance. This intuition cannot be proven from the principle of sufficient reason, that's das Bundes, but may only be shown present within the human. Everything that is this substance and within this substance. And all scientific knowledge must equivalently be that primordial intuition itself and within it. In accordance with the Indian traditions, Krause holds that to achieve this intuition or vision of God, to achieve what the Vedas call the intuition of Brahma, the ego needs to free its mind from worldly affairs, reflect on the nature of the divine being, and let itself be illuminated by God in its thinking, willing, and feeling. As Krause says, in the sacred books of the Indians too, we find the doctrine of the removal of all superfluous things which scatter the mind and the spirit in useless multiplicity and keep them from the contemplation and striving of the most essential truths regarding the nature of the divine being. If successful, the thought of this divine being, the thought of Shiva, as Krause interestingly enough also quotes God, is recognized by the ego in its content as an infinite and unconditioned thought, Krause says, whoever thinks this thought purely and clearly must also think that there is nothing whatsoever outside of this being. From the other side, however, in this thought, it is thought that the infinite being contains everything finite that is there. For because there's nothing outside of it, and because finitude is, as we know with immediate certainty, because also we know with immediate certainty that we are finite beings, everything finite can only be thought of as being in the one unconditional infinite being that is thought. Therefore, since in the one infinite being is thought, therefore, since the one infinite being is thought of as everything determinate as being in itself, it is thought of as the one ground of all finite things, therefore also as the one ground of the world. So everything finite that the ego is able to recognize is contained in the thought of this divine being and is recognized as being contained in it. That is, whatever the object of its thought, when the ego, so when we, knowingly recognize it, it recognizes it only as ontologically grounded in and through God, but not only, but also epistemologically included in the thought of God himself. It follows, therefore, that if the thought of the Absolute is the self-indication of God, there is no object of reference outside of the Absolute. Everything that the ego can know, everything that is then the one infinite and unconditional God, and the finite constituted in and through God. No. According to Krause, the thought of God thus specified is indeed self-verifying, since the thought of the infinite and unconditioned one could not be thought at all if it were not always already. So the Heideggerian Jehemation, if it were not always already the self-revelation of the infinite being in the finite consciousness of the ego. As Krause says, when we're conscious of this thought God, we are at the same time conscious that this thought, even as our thought, cannot be grounded and caused by ourselves, nor by any other finite being, but that the possibility and the reality of this thought of ours can only be thought of as being based on the content of the thought through essence of God himself. As in the Indian traditions, according to Krause, God or Shiva has to be understood as the very cause of our own knowledge of ultimate reality. As he says, in the Upanishad, God is also expressly recognized as the cause of human knowledge of God. The highest inner state of the spiritual being united with God is called Turiya in the Upanishad and is described in detail. So in light of this Panentheism, Krause even provided what seems to be his interpretation of the famous Tattvamasi. As he says, this stone, this plant, this animal, this rock, this you am I. And you, O animal, are I. I am you, and you, O tree, are I. And I am you. We beings are all we, all one I, in the primordial I, one being, one thou, one it, one essence. Just 5 minutes.
5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes.
Yeah, I think that can still do this, yeah. So Krause's Panentheism is deeply dialectical because it takes different perspectives on God and God's relation to the world, which are best understood in terms of an organic whole and the relation between the whole and its metaphysical parts. The central axiom on which Krause's Panentheism rests is that an organic whole has logical and metaphysical priority over its parts and their interrelationships, because such a whole is something in which all parts, quote, are with each other and persist, not just as a whole in which parts stand side by side and are combined into a mere aggregate. Rather, in such a whole, the parts are all in, with, and through each other, and are all only in, with, and through the whole. Such a whole, regardless of whether it is a living whole or not is what Krause calls an organism, where an organism is every essence which contains parts connected to form a whole, each of which is something specific and persists for itself. But nevertheless, each part only persists for itself in that, and so long as it is in a specific connection and interaction with all other elements which, together with it, make up the organism. So against this background, Krause introduces three different perspectives on an organic whole and its relation to its parts, as well as their interrelationships. And in naming these perspectives, also relies on prefixes he found in Sanskrit. Well, in fact, he has a whole metaphysics of language in which he justifies why these sounds are fitting to express what they semantically express. So, like in the Om perspective, there is a unity because the sound is when you pronounce it in your body. Yeah. So the Om perspective. So if we consider God or the Absolute from the Om perspective, the following happens. If all parts of a whole, as well as all relations of all parts of a whole, with other parts of this whole are considered, then that whole is regarded as Om essential. The totality of all parts of a whole, including all relations of all parts of a whole, Krause also calls the organism of this whole. Second perspective, the Or perspective. When a whole is viewed as the whole that it is, including all of its parts and the relations of all its parts, then it is considered Or essential, or as an Or essence. And then we have finally the Ur perspective. So when a whole is viewed as the whole it is, without recourse to its parts and their relationships, then it is considered Ur essential. On this perspective, the whole has metaphysical and logical priority over its parts. So when it comes to God, these three perspectives allow us to consider the relationship between God and the world as follows. Insofar as the world is thought as a relational intrinsic determination of the divine organism, God is thought of as the Om essence. And insofar as God is thought as the one whole and self-same being, together with its parts and their relations, God is thought of as the Or essence. And finally, if the divine organism is considered to be a whole that has logical and metaphysical priority over its parts, then God is considered as the Ur essence. 2 minutes, 2 more minutes?
Yeah.
So we can maybe, so maybe slide, no, not yet. Oh, yeah, maybe, yeah. Yeah. So, and I will show you a diagram at the end, which maybe makes it more intuitive. But deploying these different perspectives on a whole and its relation to its parts, deployed to the concept of God or the Absolute and its relation to the world, Krause thought that he was able to solve the old dispute whether God is above the world or separated from the world or the world is outside of it. So Krause says, through this, therefore, is proven the fundamentally important distinction between the following two propositions. The world is outside of God, and the world is outside of God as Ur essence. The first sentence, Krause says, is fundamentally false because apart from God, not as Ur essence, nothing is conceivable, in that the infinity and unconditionality of God would be denied by the slightest external appearance. But the other sentence, that the world is outside of and under God, insofar as God is the Ur essence, states a fundamental essential property of God. I think you can now slide to the last. Yeah, I don't have time, but yeah. I mean, basically, this sums it up quite nicely. If you would have the time to think about it a bit longer, probably. I mean, now it was a bit much. So Krause thinks that this is the key to all insights, basically, and also the structure of ultimate reality and the structure of the Absolute and its relation to the world, as one as the structure of the relation of the infinite and the finite, the one and the many. So God, the Absolute, is considered as Orwesen, so this is the Om, is just this. So this is the infinite and unconditioned being, outside of which there is nothing. However, the world, which is constituted by nature and spirit, and together they constitute humanity, is to be separated from the whole insofar as we consider the whole as having logical priority over its parts. And I think in this way, Krause tried to solve the riddle how the world is related to God, because insofar as we consider God as our essence, the world is part of the intrinsic inner determination of the absolute, and insofar as we consider a whole that has logical priority over its parts, we can separate, we can distinguish between the world being a part of God and God. I think I'm just about inside. Excellent. Good. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's it for now.
Thank you so much. Let's open the floor for questions, and perhaps we can stop sharing so we see our audience also. Questions? Yes, please.
Just two questions. One question is there any other philosopher who has in mind? I missed at the very beginning, so perhaps you already said this, but if you could use the rules of Hegel, or is there someone else who's his main interlocutor in the European tradition? And then the other question is just, this is really fascinating, this the way he's flashing out it out in terms of priority, so logical priority. What does he mean? Can you say more about what he means by logical priority?
Yeah. I mean, concerning your first question, I mean, Krause, what I said at the beginning, he was for a few terms, he was a student of Schelling, but then they fell apart. And then later he was basically a colleague of Schelling and Hegel, and he was also a teacher of Schopenhauer. His main influence on his own account have been, well, Immanuel Kant, so the critique of the reason. So he understood himself as, I mean, they all thought that they finished what Kant started, so Krause was no exception. And then it is a lot of guys, actually. So there's a lot of Thomas Aquinas in it. There's a lot of Christian Wolff, so he knew Christian Wolff very well, and Spinoza too. And well, also the Platonic tradition. So in a way, he said, well, what I'm doing in my way is, well, what I find in the Indian and in the Platonic, Neoplatonic traditions, those metaphysics of unity, I want to combine that with a transcendental Kantian philosophy that brings it all together. So in his larger work, he starts with subjective reflections, transcendental reflections. He calls it the analytical ascending way of science, which leads you through transcendental reflections to this vision of God. And from there, he proceeds in a synthetically descending way, deducing all the concepts in a kind of Hegelian way. I mean, yeah. I mean, the main point of difference with Hegel probably is that in Hegel, there's more movement and more dialectics, so where with spirit has to overcome nature or all these things. And in Krause, well, it's already there, it's already self-differentiated, the absolute. So, yeah. Concerning your second question, biological priority, he means metaphysical priority. And on his account, yeah, that's not yet an answer to your question, is it? Oh, is it? Yeah, I mean, he would say that logic is a part of metaphysics, and so all the metaphysics, the logic. So his logic, basically, he derives his logic, his syllogistics, out of the vision of God, where he says, well, God, we can see that God is infinite and unconditioned, and he says, well, infinite and unconditioned. So these are the two main. Could you maybe go back to the last slide? He says these are the main attributes of the divine being. And he says, well, but unconditionality actually is just a negative term for freedom. And infinity, he says, is just a negative term for being a whole, self-same being. So, and he says, well, although they're the same, being free and being a whole, we can distinguish them within the divine being also. And this is the ultimate metaphysical reason for distinction. And well, I mean, well, this is just, well, you can use this to show the validity or soundness of all justification of syllogistics. Yeah, and in his logic, if I might just add, he developed a logical system which is actually quite close to Frege's Begriffsschrift. So he wasn't quite yet there, but almost. So that's an interesting paper by Uwe Meixner on Krause's logic in the European Journal for Philosophy of Religion, where he argues that the so-called Venn diagrams should better be called Krause diagrams, because Krause was the first to have a complete combinatorics of this. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Benedikt. Perhaps a follow-up. You mentioned at some point that God grounds the world. So I was wondering, because of course, nowadays we have this big debate about grounding, ontological dependence, and so on. So could you locate? I mean, in which sense we can say, according to Krause, that the God grounds the world?
Yeah, okay. According to Krause, in the analytical ascending part leading up to the intuition of the absolute, when I just reflect on myself, I find that I participate in two realms of being: spirit, Geist, Vernunft, reason, and body, nature. And he says, well, I as a being find myself as a whole in which nature and spirit are yet already united. And he then further reflects that we use the term the world in such a way that we that it refers to the sum, aggregate / organism of all finite things. So basically, the world, according to Krause, is everything that is part of reason, everything that is part of nature, and everything that is part of humanity. Because he says, well, this is when we talk about the world, this is what we mean, and each of these is finite. So even spirit or nature, infinite in their own way, they are from an absolute point of view finite entities, because nature is not what spirit is. But they are already yet, so if this is nature and reason, but they are yet already united. And Krause asks, well, how can this be? Nature cannot unite itself with reason on its own accord, neither can spirit unite itself with nature on its own accord. So there is a need for something which explains, / in which it is grounded, that nature and spirit are yet already united in a way we find them in phenomenological reflections. And he says that can only be something which is not finite in itself, because then the same question would repeat itself. So it has to be something infinite and unconditioned. And so Krause tries to arrive at this idea that if we ask for the ground of the world, and Krause also distinguishes between a cause, like an efficient cause, and ground, Ursache, Grund und Cause, Ursache, Grund, Ground. And he says, as far as our phenomenological reflections carry us, we come to a point of enlightenment, of this vision of the absolute, where we just see that it has to be. I mean, we cannot prove the existence of the infinite unconditioned being, because Krause's conception of a proof, well, is that of, I think we mentioned yesterday, of that of, as we mentioned yesterday in the Islamic debate. So that the proof had to be something higher. The proof for Krause is always deduction from principles, and so you cannot prove the existence of God, because you would have to deploy another principle which contains the existence of God, and that, in the case of the one infinite, is not possibly conceptual. So that's his idea of grounding. So he starts with reflection on the finite, nature and spirit world, and then he sees, well, the only explanation can be, maybe it's a kind of move of argument to the best explanation also, I don't know, but this is his main idea. Jonathan?
Thank you. Very interesting talk in person. Yeah, he's not, you mentioned who he studied with and his immediate years and things like that. He's not too well known outside of that.
No.
How does he have any people like Heidegger or Husserl? Did people like that read him? Does he have a commentary on tradition, so to speak?
Whether he has a commentary on the tradition?
Well, I mean, does he have people who have written about him?
Oh, well, I mean,
How well known is he in the term of tradition today?
not as much as he deserves. I mean, there was a high time of Krausism shortly after his death, up until probably the First World War. And he was quite popular and quite so that the Krauses in Germany and in the Netherlands and Belgium, like people like Heinrich von Arendt, who actually also organized the first philosophers' congress where women participated and were allowed to speak in 1869 in Prague, because they had a quite liberal political agenda. And then after the Second World War, it wasn't so popular in the Weimar Republic. Husserl's terminology in Ideas, for instance, in Ideas 1, it's quite close to Krause, because Husserl also talks about Wesensschau, so essence and the essence. And it is debatable whether Krause had an influence on Husserl. I mean, Nikolai Hartmann, I said at the beginning, still referred to Krause as one of the leading figures of German idealism. And given the fact that the whole of Spanish modernity started with a translation of one of Krause's books, interestingly enough, Krause's main influence, Das Urbild der Menschheit. It's so I don't know the Spanish title, probably have it, something with Para la vida, something, I don't know. Started Spanish modernity in 1865. I mean, in Krause, for instance, his philosophy of right and philosophy of law, it's quite indirectly, I mean, he advanced the capability approach. So quite close to the one today argued for by Martha Nussbaum and Matthias Senn, for instance. So it's all there in Krause, and the Pope, actually, Pope Francis, probably without knowing, is quite close in his encyclical Laudato Si to what Krause had to say. And so in the research, there are some research papers arguing that Pope Francis, well, is a Krausis without knowing because of the Argentinian context in which he probably was educated. So, but there is no main, he's not a big player in German philosophy these days. I mean, I'm trying to change that because it's just so very modern also and very, very good. And, you know. And the reason why not, was a part of the question, is probably historically he never managed to get a chair of philosophy. I mean, Schelling prevented that in Munich in 1832. And another reason why probably he's not so popular as he deserves is that at one point he decided to pick up the Leibnizian project of a scientific lingua franca, and he thought, well, the German language first must delete all Latin, all English, all French terms and replace them with original German words, which Krause ultimately drew back to Sanskrit. But his later writings are quite demanding because it's full of neologisms, and I mean, you've seen it today with Umwesen, Ohrwesen, Urwesen, and those were the light ones. So what you can, yeah, so I think that is also one of the reasons. Yeah.
90-second question.
Yes, very quick.
Very quick, very brief answer.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'll say it very quickly. It's just a basic misunderstanding by me. So the intuition or the vision we have is of the infinite and of maybe us being finite. How does that translate to a mereological view where the infinite's a whole and we're parts? Like at what point does that come in?
That would be another way to frame the same point for Krause. So Krause refers to us as Teilganze, like part wholes. So the absolute is the whole, and everything finite is a part, a metaphysical part.
What's the argument that the relationship between infinite and finite has to be a whole part relationship? Is it just that there's no other option?
The argument is that once we climbed up to be able to see that to see the infinite and unconditioned being, there is no other choice than us being a part of. Very roughly.
Okay.
Very roughly.
Thank you very much.